Hi, I'm your host, Bob Powell. We're proud to welcome you to the Exceptional Advisor podcast series brought to you by the Investments and Wealth Institute. This series aims to help you to better serve your clients, differentiate yourself from the competition, and enhance your ability to communicate those differences.
Jonathan Payne is a director of JP Consulting and has 35 years of international investment experience, having led investment teams in London, Bahrain, and Australia. He is the author and publisher of a widely read investment newsletter, The Payne Report, and is well known for his contrarian views. Jonathan is also a regular guest on CNBC and Sky Business TV, and he'll be speaking at the upcoming Investments and Wealth Forum in New York City in December. Welcome to the podcast, Jonathan.
Thank you, Bob. It's a real pleasure to be with you this morning. And my goodness me, you couldn't have chosen a more interesting time in terms of the history of the world for our conversation today.
That is so true. But before we get to that, for the benefit of our listeners who may not be familiar with you and your work, do you mind just sharing a brief overview?
Oh, absolutely. Bob, I go back in time, I think as long as you do, Bob, to the 80s. In fact, just before we started the recording, you and I were both sharing our memories and reminiscing about the 87 crash and all of the events since that time. So I started in London in 1984. In fact, I worked for an American bank, Manufacturers Hanover, which I remember my family thought I'd started working for a German manufacturing firm when I told them I joined them. But Manufacturers Hanover Investment Management Limited in London in 1984. I've also worked in the Middle East for an institution in Bahrain. I've worked for the French back in London. And then the Rothschilds asked me to head up the Rothschild Australia asset management team here in Australia in 1997, my goodness me. So look, I was raised in Africa. I was born in South Africa, but left there when I was very young. And my father moved my brothers and I to Lesotho, a tiny little country in the middle of South Africa, and then on to Swaziland. Then, heaven forbid, he dragged me kicking and screaming to go to university in the United Kingdom, which I didn't want to do. And so then from England to the Middle East, then from the Middle East to Australia. So I've lived in 6 countries, and I have an absolute fascination with the world and everything that's happening in it. And I feel incredibly privileged to have been in the financial markets now for, what is that, Bob? Is that 38 years? And about the same time, I think, as you have been.
Yeah.
And I must confess, I really love every minute of it.
So 2 things. One is, you're currently writing the Payne Report, and you do that, is that weekly, or how often, and for how long have you been doing that?
Well, I write it every Saturday. So I live here in Australia. So I wait for the US markets to close your Friday at 4 p.m. And then I endeavor to pick up my pen here in Australia and publish on the Saturday Australian time. I do it weekly. When did I first start that? I started a monthly edition in about 2009, 2010. I became kind of independent. I left the corporate world, so to speak, the institutional asset management world. I decided to head out on my own and try and write without fear and without favor and share my fascination for the world. And so, yes, I've been writing it for some time. It's always exciting to get subscribers from every corner of the world. I got one recently from Zambia in Africa. And I actually wrote to them. I said, how on earth did you hear of me? And the chap said, look, I retired a long time ago. He was actually, I shouldn't really share this, I suppose, in a public forum, but had been a member of the Zambian government. And he said, I think I was in an airport lounge and saw you on television. And anyway, he became a subscriber, and we now correspond. So the great thing about writing a subscription-based investment newsletter, you create friendships all around the world, sadly, with people that I will probably never, ever meet, but they share the most amazing confidences with me, which I always very much appreciate.
Yeah. Before we get to the topic in your most recent newsletter, if I'm not mistaken, I think you wrote about your father in one of your recent issues and the influence he had on your life. Is that correct?
Absolutely. My father was the professor of law at university in Lesotho and Swaziland. And my father used to edit my pain report. He passed away in December 2015. And I must confess, his command of the English language and grammar is far, far superior to my own. And there's many occasions where he would get his pencil out and cross out various words, particularly punctuation. He used to say, Jonathan, you spray commas and semicolons across the page like confetti. And one day he took about 45 minutes deliberating as to whether it was a colon, a semicolon, or a comma. I said, Dad, please, 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 I don't care whether you put a colon, a semicolon. I don't care what you put in that sentence. I just need to publish.
Yes, I had an old editor who used to say that white space isn't an option. So whether it's ready or not, it's going.
The other thing, Bob, just quickly to finish off on my father, he often used to get terribly upset when I used kind of hyperbole and I was too melodramatic. And on many times he'd say, you've got to tone that down, Jonathan. You can't possibly say things like that. I said, Dad, I'm independent now. I speak, I hope, without fear and without favor. And that's an opinion I have. And so he used to always try and be a kind of voice of moderation and caution. So I often, so many times, think about him as I write the report and how he would edit it. And I can often hear his voice counseling me as I'm actually writing. So quite extraordinary.
Yeah. Well, I hope you have his copy of Fowler's by your side or something like that.
Yes.
All right. So let's talk about your latest newsletter, what you wrote, your current thoughts about the Ukraine-Russia crises and where we are and where we're going.
Well, Bob, I really do believe this is a very defining moment in time, a watershed moment in time. In terms of, as we turn the pages of geopolitical history, the invasion of Ukraine by Russia last Thursday is a really incredibly defining moment. I think many of us, and I made the mistake, as I always do, of seeking counsel from Russian experts, people who had studied Putin for decades and, were students of Russian and Ukrainian history and the politics between the two nations. And so many of them were telling me that Putin just won't invade. The consequences would be too significant. And I think the majority of expert opinion was that he just wouldn't do it. He was just basically trying to ensure that Ukraine wouldn't join NATO, so on and so forth. And we kind of know that history now. But so he did the unthinkable. And here we are, Bob. And I think each of us, we're pinching ourselves that this is really happening in the year 2022. And here is a military superpower that has invaded Ukraine. And I think, what are we now, only 6 days into the invasion? Let me just try and take a bit of a step back and try and see through the so-called fog of war. I must confess, I'm very concerned that in recent months and perhaps even years, we've seen the emergence of an axis of autocracy. And this union, this alliance between Russia and China, led by autocrats, is looking to redefine the global world order. Now, I know that, it's tempting to get too melodramatic about these things, particularly when we see the tragic scenes on our television screens. But I really do believe that Putin did not fully predict the response and the unity within the so-called US-led Western Alliance, NATO, European Union. I really do believe that when Russian forces invaded, that he saw a fractured NATO and European Union. And I think he's been shocked at the degree of unity and resolve and purpose that we've seen. In particular, let's just quickly remind ourselves that it was over a month ago that the British were flying in these anti-tank rockets into Ukraine, and the Germans wouldn't even allow the Royal Air Force to fly over German airspace. They had to take a more circuitous route. However, this weekend, we saw Olaf Scholz, the new Chancellor of Germany, speaking to the Bundestag, the German parliament, and standing ovation after standing ovation effectively ripped up German foreign policy and defense policy. And now Germany today is supplying weapons to Ukraine, whereas previously they'd only agreed to send 5,000 helmets to Ukraine. So this is a seismic shift in Germany's response and its pursuit of foreign policy. And it looks like it's fully endorsed by the German parliament. We've seen the British being incredibly determined to alert the world to the dangers that were ahead of us. And they've been proven correct. US intelligence really got this one right. I mean, I remember listening to Sullivan, your national security advisor, spelling it out to the press that the intelligence showed that Putin had made the decision to invade Ukraine. And there was much skepticism about that. We also know that Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, traveled to the Chinese Winter Olympics and spent up to 5 hours with President of China, Xi Jinping. And so this is a moment we need to be a little bit honest with ourselves. Do we really believe that Vladimir Putin did not raise with his counterpart, Xi Jinping, that he was about to invade Ukraine and in fact had already made the decision? Much speculation that Xi Jinping countered by saying, please don't do it during the Winter Olympics because it would distract attention away from our Winter Games. I mean, Vladimir Putin goes back to Moscow. The intelligence services kept telling us he's going to go in, and subsequently he did. So what I'm trying to say is, in a nutshell, I think we've got to accept a new geopolitical reality, and that both Russia and China have chosen or believe that now is the time to challenge the post-war political reality. And if that is the case, I have to ask ourselves the question, what is next? How far do we go? And also, as some have been speculating, is this, from Beijing's perspective, a dress rehearsal for a possible invasion or occupation of Taiwan? What is incredibly interesting is the events of this weekend. First and foremost, as I've already described, Germany's response, which I think has surprised many of us. But also, of course, the action taken by many nations to exclude many Russian banks from the SWIFT international payment system, and also the sanctioning of the Russian central bank. Let's remember that Russia is a member of the G20. The only similar type actions that have ever been taken out in terms of SWIFT and also sanctions against central banks have been against North Korea, Iran, and Venezuela, never a G20 country. So effectively, the Western or US-led alliance is rendering Russia uninvestable. This is drastic action. And we're seeing Putin already respond to that. So this event has galvanized and energized and without doubt united this kind of US-led Western alliance, because I believe many see the possibility that this could take place in Taiwan. Now, I've been a little bit controversial there, so I better pause for breath.
Well, I'm not sure if you're alone in thinking that Taiwan is next, that this has been a dry run for Xi Jinping to see what the world response would be. I'm curious, as you think about what's next, do you see this bifurcation perhaps of Russia, China, I don't know, India, UAE, name the countries that sort of side with the Russian-Chinese bloc, and then NATO, EU, I'm not sure who else. and then maybe independent countries. I don't know where Ireland stands per se as this all shakes out, but any thoughts about what's next? Like, do we see a black and white world in that regard?
Well, I think we are, as I said, I mean, I've taken a long time and I've been very reluctant to kind of bring myself to believing that we have got this new kind of axis of autocracy led by Russia and China, and that they now believe, this is the time to challenge the prevailing global kind of system of governance. You might throw in Iran into that axis, and perhaps I think North Korea would probably be a willing participant in that new axis of autocracy. So, what's next is, well, let's just go down the murky path. And I'm always very conscious whenever I speak on issues relating to Taiwan, that it is a highly, highly emotive subject. And I have friends all over the world, and I always endeavor, I really do try, Bob, I promise you, to be as objective and clear-sighted and analytical as I possibly can. But for me, any student of history will acknowledge that autocrats and dictators generally do what they say they're going to do. And we can go back through history to verify that. And in China, now that the president, Xi Jinping, has had the constitution changed to enable him to serve a third term. And I've studied Xi Jinping for a very long time, and I've been a student of China's affairs and politics and the economy since the late 80s. And so I really have spent a lot of my professional career being a fascinated student of all things China. And I do read all of Xi Jinping's speeches and certainly watch his public addresses. And Xi Jinping has said himself that he will not leave the situation or the issue of Taiwan to future generations. Therefore, he has resolved to deal with this issue. And he speaks of the Chinese dream and the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, and also to reverse what the Chinese see as a century of colonial humiliation. Xi Jinping fervently believes that the Chinese motherland needs to be restored and reunited. In that fundamental regard, Xi Jinping, in my view, and this is my opinion, will, in his time as president, reunite Taiwan with China. Now, whenever we get into this conversation, this is where it starts getting very controversial. And the question is always asked, what will the United States and what will the Western alliance do about that? And for a very, very long time, many of us have had the view that America had the balance of military and naval superiority, an overwhelming superiority. However, if you read any military analysis over the last several years, China's naval and military capabilities have dramatically improved. And it has been my view, and I've published this view, that in the specific theater we are talking about, South and East China Sea and the Strait of Taiwan, and that China has an undeniable ascendancy and the capability through this extraordinary missile arsenal to combat US or allied capability in that region. Now, I don't want to drill down into this too much because there's so much more to discuss about what's happening in the world. But at the end of the day, perhaps what we're seeing in Ukraine is a dress rehearsal. I know a lot of people, friends of mine who I respect enormously, who are of that opinion, and I've had those conversations. I've long been a believer that the world is large enough to accommodate many different nations. I used to believe, and I emphasize, I used to believe, so let me be very clear, in 2002 and 2003, I used to speak of a sleeping giant awakes. I used to speak optimistically about the rise of China. I used to speak enthusiastically that the most significant and defining economic phenomenon of our lifetime, again, this is what I used to say in 2003, is the rise of the Asian middle classes, and that they will shape and define the topography of the global economic landscape for many decades to come. I used to also say that I passionately believed that the liberalization of the Chinese economy would eventually lead to its democratization. I was of the view that, in essence, if a country embraced a free market system, which China began to do, as we know, in the 80s and into the 90s, and accelerated in the new millennium, that inevitably a free market system would be fertile grounds for political pluralism, greater liberalism, freedom of expression, and all of those things that we take for granted in Western liberal democracies. I therefore spoke optimistically that embracing liberal free enterprise would set off a chain reaction in China, leading to its democratization. I very reluctantly changed my mind not long after the ascendancy of Xi Jinping, when it became quite evident to all of us who follow all things China that Xi Jinping was different, that Xi Jinping believed in the supremacy of the Chinese Communist Party, that the Chinese Communist Party must at all times be the dominant entity, institution, and everything was subservient to the party. And in recent times, we've seen him restrict, constrain, and contain the private sector. We've seen that with Alibaba, we've seen it with Tencent, because some of their individual chief executives had become too big for their boots in the eyes of Xi Jinping. If we follow all of the events of the last 12 to 18 months, all of the intervention by the Chinese government and the suppression, in essence, of the free market system, we can only come to one possible conclusion, that actually Xi Jinping completely and fundamentally disagreed with what I thought was the pathway that China had embarked upon in the 90s and in the early 2000s. And he decided that, in fact, the Chinese system was superior to that, particularly of the United States. He's spoken regularly about the polarization and the kind of dysfunctional nature of Western society, and that democracy is a fundamentally flawed, philosophical and ideological concept. He does believe that the Chinese system is superior. Therefore, he is, hell-bent to continue on this path, which will lead to continuing suppression, repression of political opponents, freedom of expression. I mean, the Chinese media today, Bob, is completely and utterly controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. So, it's sometimes a bit awkward, providing perspectives on my views on China. I just want to say to everyone listening, that I really did believe it was different this time in China with the economic liberalization that Deng Xiaoping began all those decades ago. And when I full and optimistic, I'm afraid I've had to revise that optimism over the last several years, and with great sadness. I think with regard to Russia, I think the writing's been on the wall for some time. In fact, I was once apprehended or admonished by a certain Russian who came to a speech of mine many, many years ago, because I hadn't included Russia in my global investment outlook. And he challenged me as to why I hadn't. Then actually invited me to Russia and wanted me to go on a kind of a tour so that I could then come back and sing the praises of investing in Russia. And I somewhat awkwardly said, I'm afraid, I thank you so much for the invitation, but I'm afraid I haven't visited Russia. And one of my issues is your president, Vladimir Putin. And he asked me what my problem was. And I then articulated it, or I made the mistake of doing so. and he was incredibly annoyed with me. And he said, "You are not allowed to say this." I said, "What do you mean? I can't criticize the president of Russia." He said, "No, you must not." I said, "Incidentally, we're not in Russia." I can't remember where I was. Probably was Australia, maybe Singapore. But I said, "Are you telling me that I can't be critical of the Russian president?" And he said, "No, you're not permitted to say these things." And that kind of confirmed to me, the situation. Look, the bottom line is the writing has been on the wall for a while. And I'm afraid, sadly and tragically, Putin has confirmed all our worst fears. This is now a reality. And I know I've been going on a rather long time, Bob, but I was interviewed on, I think it was CNBC yesterday. I don't think they're going to replay the interview, but I made the point that I'm very hopeful. I'm very hopeful that the Russian military, or any semblance of Russian leadership, if Putin hasn't got rid of them, it basically says enough is enough. We've seen enough. And the implied veiled threat that the Russian president made on the weekend about the use of nuclear weapons, and the fact that he's put the Russian nuclear forces on alert, should be of grave concern to us all. I'm optimistic, Bob, that the younger generation in Russia in particular is going to say, this is not the Russia that I want. Vladimir Putin and his war in Ukraine is not something I want to be associated with. And I also said on television yesterday, no wonder they didn't actually replay the interview. I said, this is a time when Xi Jinping and the Chinese government should really ask themselves the question, do we want to be associated with this invasion? Do we want to be associated with a president, Vladimir Putin, who is committing these shocking atrocities that all of us in the world are witness to? I mean, this is your moment, Xi Jinping. I mean, do you really want to go down in history as the leader who supported what is happening today in Ukraine? I mean, I'm so hopeful that the Chinese will see sense and distance themselves and condemn Vladimir Putin. Alas, my geopolitical friends tell me that is extremely unlikely, and that the alliance between Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin is rock solid. They have met 38 times, and it is no secret. It is no secret at all. They get on incredibly well. They've got a strong personal bond. More disturbingly, however, they have the same worldview. And that's what really alarms me.
Yeah. So it strikes me, you titled your last newsletter, "It's Time to Take Sides." It strikes me that there's some economic consequences to this kind of alliance, that China runs the risk of not being able to sell its goods to the rest of the world. And there aren't enough middle class in Russia or enough industry in Russia to make up for the difference if we were to boycott, right, the purchase of Chinese goods. And obviously, from a global supply chain point of view, this is quite disruptive. People will have to create manufacturing facilities in their countries to make up for what was built in China at one time. But do you see that as an outcome, that this is economic suicide for them to go down this path?
Well, you raise some incredibly important issues, and it talks to so many of the problems we have at the moment, insofar as we have this dislocation and disruption of global supply chains. We're currently experiencing, in my view, what could best be described as a kind of global food and energy crisis. And we know the dependency of European nations on Russian natural gas. In fact, nearly 50% of natural gas requirements in Europe are satisfied by Russian exports. We know that Russia is a commodity superpower, and that in fact combined, Ukraine and Russia provide 2/3 of the world's ammonium nitrate. Now that might sound a little bit esoteric. That's an essential ingredient for fertilizer. And we know also that Ukraine is described as a breadbasket of Europe, and their exports of wheat and corn. It's palladium, it's titanium, it's nickel, it's right across the board. So this conflict in Ukraine and the potential for further tit-for-tat retaliation in terms of sanctions could inflame or exacerbate an already highly inflationary global economic conditions. So I'm afraid it really comes at a bad time in terms of the context of what is already, I think, a food and energy crisis. It also complicates, of course, the agenda for global central banks, particularly the US central bank, that looks like it's about to embark upon a tightening of monetary policy. So there's so many question marks around this conflict. But in terms of the decisions that China has to make, this is my view, Bob. China really has to make a call here. Their primary market is the United States and nations within the so-called, well, let's not use the word so-called, within the Western Alliance. And let's just be very careful about our geography here. It's a bit of a misnomer. Western Alliance is pretty much the rest of the world. It's not a Western geographic situation. I mean, we have South Korea, we have Japan. I could go through the list. Yeah. I mean, we've got Vietnam. I mean, they're not particularly fond of the Chinese, particularly given their navy is taken up much of their fishing rights and waters that they've fished for over 1,000 years in the South China Sea. But I digress. The bottom line is China needs to make a decision. If China supports Russia in this blatantly illegal invasion, and forget the pretext that Vladimir Putin has been pumping out through his disinformation campaigns. I mean, this is a blatant act of aggression. Is China willing to sacrifice the consumers in the United States, the nation of shop till you drop, the consumers in Western Europe, the consumers in South Korea and Japan, and many, many, many other countries? This is a time to choose sides. I'm begging my friends in Beijing to really see this in a realistic light. I know the prism through which they view the world is being conditioned by much propaganda and the like. But at the end of the day, there's 7 billion people in this world. And I still believe we can all live in harmony. And quite frankly, supporting a person such as Vladimir Putin with his shocking record, poisoning and assassinating his political opponents in broad daylight, and now invading Ukraine. China needs to take sides here. And I hope and pray that China that sees what's right and the light of day and joins us in condemning this. And then I'll become that much more optimistic. If, however, they stay on the path that they have chosen, I'm afraid then, things are going to get much more complicated, and things will get more complicated in the realm of supply chains and the dislocation thereof, in the realm of the food and energy crisis. I mean, if Russia turns off the natural gas pipelines into Western Europe, then we face some very, very difficult times. But central banks around the world are having to grapple with all this in real time. They had set out on the pathway to normalize monetary policy, as we know, and the markets started pricing. Bank of America, I think, is pricing 7 rate hikes. They might have backed off slightly with events in Ukraine, but last I saw was 7. And then I think even Goldman's is up there as well. And I keep being asked, how many rate hikes do I anticipate for the US central bank in the remainder of this year? I kind of want to go 5 or 6, but I then start pulling myself back and saying, you know what? By the time we get to the 4th or the 5th one, they're probably going to pull back a little bit. And I've been an advocate that they should normalize monetary policy for a very long period of time. But I remember, Bob, what a famous and eminent British economist said, obviously John Maynard Keynes: when the facts change, I change my mind. What do you do? Yeah. And my goodness gracious me, the facts have just changed because a certain Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine last Thursday. And, quite frankly, that wasn't kind of on the radar as a very, very high probability event. So the facts are changing. The inflationary landscape is changing. And if anything, I think the events in Ukraine have inflamed and amplified an already rather poor inflationary environment. Wouldn't it be great, Bob, if we were sitting on the FOMC in a couple of weeks' time and assisting Jerome Powell and his colleagues in their deliberations? It's going to be interesting. That geopolitical analysis is going to be on the agenda. And the Fed always prides itself on, yes, we kind of keep an eye on that stuff, but at the end of the day, it's the domestic economy and our mandate of full employment and inflation at 2%. And obviously, as we know, consumer price inflation is 7.5%. And we could have an 8 in front of the decimal point in the next few months, because energy prices certainly haven't rolled over as many anticipated months ago. You know, the Fed is caught in a difficult place here, Bob. I think they have to commence the tightening. They have to seek the normalization of monetary policy because the economy is robust and inflation is way above multiples of what they anticipated. So yes, I am of the view that we need to normalize monetary policy, and the sooner the better. And I am of the view that we need to go down the path of quantitative tightening, the reversal of quantitative easing. But all of that suggests to me, you know, very significant volatility, which is what we're already seeing because there's so much uncertainty at the present time.
So the facts have changed the plan, but oftentimes financial advisors are telling their clients, we're going to stick with the plan that we created. So what advice do you have for advisors around the portfolios they've created with respect to stocks, bonds, I don't know, commodities, whatever they might own for their clients' portfolios?
This is a time, I think, Bob, where all of the fundamental principles of investing come to fruition and I think shine through. And the fundamental principles of all the great investors in terms of diversification and having kind of a balance in the portfolio. So in that context, I don't think cash should be viewed as this kind of evil thing. I think it provides for optionality moving forward. So, you know, a small amount in cash as a kind of reservoir, as a kind of insurance policy, and then broad diversification. We don't have the time to talk about the potential geography of that diversification. As you can tell from what I've said so far, Bob, I am afraid I am defensive and conservative in the near term. I do actually consult to a number of investment institutions and I sit on their investment committees. And also, obviously, I have my readership through my weekly pain report. It would be inconsistent of me if I today said to you that I wasn't concerned. I am. And therefore, in fact, in November, I put out a view that I saw a fairly significant decline in the S&P 500 coming through the next several months. So consistent with that view, which, by the way, was then predicated on my expectation that the Fed really was way behind the curve. And this was in November 2021. And they really needed to get in front of the market and just say, come on, we're going to tighten and et cetera, et cetera. And I think that's what we've generally seen. So, you know, if I was conservative in November 21, and also driven by valuations, by the way, and also concerns by companies like Rivian, the electric vehicle maker, you know, the kind of extraordinary valuations we saw on the IPO. So there was a kind of confluence of factors that led me to be conservative in November 2021. But if you then fast forward to today, and you then incorporate the complexity surrounding the new geopolitical reality of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, I've got another reason to be cautious. So I am conservative right now. I am defensive. And that talks to a more broadly diversified portfolio, but with a fairly conservative disposition. I would like to think, and I've always been a bit of an optimist about the world. You know, Bob, I know you've traveled extensively and you've been in the financial markets as long as I have. When you get to travel around the world, I've been to over 60 countries around the world, and I've lived in 6 countries. I always have an extraordinary sense of optimism when I travel about, you know, just the amazing diversity of humanity and the opportunity and everything else. So I think we're in for some tough times here in the next several months. And I think we've got to accept that reality. The tide has turned in terms of monetary policy. Warren Buffett, of course, said a rising tide floats all boats. So,
Right.
and so the reality here is we've got a normalization of monetary policy. The reality here is we've got some concerns on the geopolitical front, and all of that suggests, and I'm saying it, as I said, to public audiences in my written reports and also to the investment committees that I sit on. I have been advocating a more conservative strategy since November. I did not foresee Vladimir Putin invading Ukraine, so I can't claim to have any foresight in that regard. But again, you know what? Let's take the world for what it is and not what we think it should be. And the reality is, unfortunately, there's a tragedy unfolding in Ukraine, and we need to navigate our way through that. And so I'm going to maintain a more conservative disposition here in the short term.
Yeah. Some advisors here stateside are, I wouldn't say grasping, but perhaps grasping. Any thoughts about what role, if any, crypto plays in this new world order?
That's a really complicated one. And Bob, I'm just going to say right up front that no one should waste any further moment of their time listening to me talk about cryptocurrencies. That is not my arena. A lot of my friends who are much smarter than I am have been talking about, Bitcoin, and my word, when they told me to buy it, Bob, boy, oh boy, you know what? I should have taken their advice, but I didn't. I can't really get my head around cryptocurrencies. I shouldn't say I can't get my head around them. I kind of understand what they are and what they represent and what investors in cryptocurrencies perceive them as being. But at the end of the day, I'm not going to pretend to have an insightful opinion on cryptocurrencies, Bob. I'm the wrong guy for that. I actually am. I'm partial over time, every now and then, to gold. It has a time and a place in a portfolio. I have actually, I'll just say on the record that I've recently been talking to a few investors and suggesting that a small allocation to gold here is probably the right thing to do. Again, in the context and interest of diversification and having some kind of insurance policy for what I think are going to be some pretty turbulent times here. So gold has its moment, and I won't bore you with my views on gold in any great detail.
That's fair. So is there anything in the most recent newsletter that you wrote that we haven't touched upon yet? Is there some other nugget that we can share with our listeners?
Well, Bob, I'll make this as brief as I possibly can. My latest report was titled, "It's Time to Take Sides." And I chose not to talk about the financial markets, which obviously had seen extraordinary volatility in response to the invasion on Thursday last week. I, in fact, chose instead to speak about a very, very, very special friend of mine who I've had the great privilege of spending time with, who is actually 99 years old. I won't use her name in this podcast. But some months ago, I had the great privilege of her telling me her life story and how at the age of 21, she had escaped Soviet occupation of her birthplace, Estonia, up in the Baltic states. And at the age of 21, she had traveled with her 8-month-old son from Estonia all the way to southern Italy. And from southern Italy, she embarked on a ship and came to Australia. As she was telling me this story, her son, who I think is now 78, was sitting next to her. And it was an amazingly powerful story. It was an emotional story. And I asked her to tell me how she did that. And she went from, I think, if I'm getting it right, from Estonia to Latvia to Lithuania, then into Poland, and then to cross the Alps via Germany into Austria, through the Alps, through northern Italy to southern Italy, that journey, largely on foot, carrying just a suitcase and an 8-month-old boy, took 5 years. 5 years. And I have the great privilege of knowing her now, and she's turning 100 quite soon. And she invited me just the other day to her 100th birthday party and said to me, Jonathan, I want to have a tequila with you on my 100th. And I cannot tell you how much I'm looking forward to that. Now, this conversation, or this story that she told me, took place a few months ago. And of course, when the Soviets occupied Estonia and she fled the Soviet occupation, in fact, her husband was captured by the Soviets and spent, I think, more than 12 years in a Russian camp. When she speaks about the Russians, it's personal. And what has been particularly distressing for her at 99 is to see the scenes of refugees leaving Ukraine, the women and the children leaving Ukraine today. It's an incredibly painful reminder for that 5-year journey that she took from Estonia to southern Italy and finally onwards by boat to Australia. That story was told to me many months ago. So it's given special meaning to the events that we're witnessing now on our screens in the year 2022. And that's why we're all pinching ourselves, are we not? That this is actually happening.
Yeah.
This is happening. And we need to accept that.
I'm still in disbelief and shock, and I don't know. I'm not even sure I have the words to describe the emotions that I have about this. So 2 things that are on my mind, Jonathan, before we wrap up. One is that you'll be speaking at an upcoming Investment and Wealth Institute conference in New York in later this year. So we are looking forward to that. As you know, you have a good many fans inside the Investments and Wealth Institute. Looking forward to hearing you speak. They'll be thrilled, I know.
I'm very much looking forward to coming to New York in December, Bob. One of my favorite cities. And I'm really, really, really looking forward to being with you all. It's very, very kind of you to invite me to speak in New York.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to actually meeting you in person in December. And then secondly, for our listeners who may want to subscribe to your newsletter, do you mind just sharing what website they should go to if they want to learn more?
Yes. Well, I'm happy for you to actually share my email address, but the website is The Pain Report. For those of you who don't know, very, very unfortunately, Pain, as in my surname, Pain, is spelled Pain. It's the real thing, the real thing. And if you still feel sorry for me, my brother's a doctor. And so there's a Dr. Pain. And in fact, there's been a Dr. Pain in our family now. I can't remember how many generations. I want to say 5 generations. It might be 4 generations, but going back a long way. So the website is The Pain Report. If you just put that in Google, it should come up. And Bob, if people want to direct email me, I'm fine with that. I'm very old fashioned. I publish a report. It goes out via email. I quite like to control basically sometimes who's reading it, if that kind of makes any sense. It is a subscription newsletter, but offline, Bob, we can talk about possibly offering some kind of special membership fee for your group. I'm very happy to offer that. It's an awful website, by the way. It was designed a long time ago, and it's not one of my strengths. But anyway, you'll see for what it is. And yeah, I would love to communicate and correspond with your members. And, life is one continuing debate. I'm a great believer in what Voltaire, the French philosopher, once said. I disagree with what you have to say, but I defend to my death your right to say it. And having lived in many countries where there was no freedom of expression, no freedom of speech, and certainly no free press, I'm a great believer in what we have and our ability to be able to speak freely without fear and without favor. And I'm a passionate exponent of that.
Well, I've lost track of time, but that seems like an appropriate place to wrap up and to thank you for sharing your knowledge and wisdom with our listeners. I, for one, am greatly appreciative of the chance to chat with you, and I'm certain our listeners will greatly appreciate it as well.
No, thank you, Bob. It's been lovely having a conversation with you. And as I said, I very much look forward to seeing you later in the year.
Thank you for listening to the Exceptional Advisor podcast brought to you by the Investments and Wealth Institute. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe through iTunes, Spotify, or our website at www.investmentsandwealth.org/podcast to get the latest episodes of our Exceptional Advisor podcast series. For additional resources, updates on events, and exclusive membership deals, visit www.investmentsandwealth.org.